Greetings YouTube and welcome to the Blue Corner and to a Cardfight deck profile. This one is going to be on a deck I have that is actually legal as opposed to being proxied out, and then that is standard Nectar post the release of set 3. With the release of AOT, Answer of Truth, coming out within a week, I realized I probably should get what I have for Nectar up and out. Granted, it's not like Answer of Truth is actually going to change the format that much. It's definitely not going to be changing Nectar's position, at least as far as where the top decks go. And that is a very respectable top 5, maybe even top 3 deck, but not quite the best, at least not without Sunlight Garden Guide to enable some of its chicanery. So that being said, I will go over the list I'm currently rocking, and I'll obviously show you guys what I'm playing in place of Garden Guide. Not particularly something impressive, but it's still something. And yeah, let's get into this. So, Nectar is a force clan with the ability to create plant tokens. Most of your abilities that involve plant token creation are pretty free. The most expensive card that creates a plant token is a Soul Blast and Sacrifice, but in that case though, you're trading one card for 2. And plant tokens are, for lack of a better term, triggers in terms of stats, as they are a grade 0 with 5,000 power and the boost ability and a crit, so they can hit a Vanguard. So because this is a force clan, you can just throw these on a force marker and still threaten your opponent for at least a card out of their hand. But mostly though, they will be used as boosters, as you don't really throw these up in the front that often unless you're on a trailing rose, and I'm not playing that card in multiples. But yeah, the token is a really neat mechanic, and I'm surprised it took this long for Vanguard to finally do them. Now, when do we get counters? And not like counter traps, like I'm talking about Yu-Gi-Oh! No, I'm talking about like spell counters and stuff like that. So that being said, let's get on to the deck itself. So for the grade 3s, I am playing 9 actually. 4 Cecilia, 4 Tomato, and for 1 Trailing Rose. I don't like Trailing Rose in multiples. Yes, it's useful as a mini soul saver for the 1 turn, but I don't like being on Trailing Rose for more than 1 turn. If I'm going to be on a grade 3 other than Cecilia for multiple turns, I'd rather it be Tomato, since it can at least dig deeper into my deck to try and hit the Cecilia to ride for the next turn. And his effect also works on Rearguard. And even though we don't have Garden Guide to generate as many tokens as the Japanese builds can, the deck can still generate enough that you should be able to resolve Tomato successfully by your turn 3. And his ability to tribute himself to summon 2 tokens to the back row is also pretty useful, as you will most commonly have a play in which you have your grade 3 Vanguard, you have your Tomato on rear, and then you have your other rear guard in the other lane. So, and you use Tomato to sack 2 of your tokens to draw a card, then you swing a Tomato, sack himself, and you just call your tokens back here so that you have some boosters for your rear guard lanes. Yeah, it's a pretty simple thing, but I guess people don't see that as the immediate thing you do with Tomato on Rearguard, but yeah, it's just a solid card, and then Trailing Rose is there just as an absolute emergency. Like, you don't ever really want to see it that often, but it can still call a token in a pinch, as it's basically a Sylvia that also has an additional bonus effect on Vanguard. Speaking of Sylvia, for the grade 2s, 4 copies of Sylvia, 4 copies of Urban Soul, and then at this point, you pretty much just have to pick between like 1 or 3 cards for the last grade 2 slot, since again we don't have guide. There's the 10k vanilla with the 10k shield. That is a thing I have thought about. There's Kaivant, who when you place it down gains 5,000 power for the turn for every grade 0 that you have in play, tokens and triggers. And then I'm playing Spinach Advisor, who gains 3k whenever you superior call a card by an effect, and this is through the course of multiple turns, only works on Rearguard. But basically, Kaivant is if you want to play a more Trailing Rose, keep your tokens in play type build, whereas this one, being that it's more Tomato focused, doesn't have very many tokens in play, so I usually can get more power off of this guy than I can with Kaivant. And Kaivant is only good for 1 turn, whereas this guy will gain power over the course of many turns. The power isn't as big, but I still believe he can hit relevant numbers, as just 1 call puts him at 13, which is enough to hit Force Vanguards without a boost. And this is a Force Clan, so he'll be at 23, and then Cecilia can make him a 33. So it's not that out of the realm of possibility for this guy to still hit decent numbers. It's just Kaivant's more useful early game, and that is something I will concede. But the other 2 grade 2s, you just play. Then for the grade 1s, 4 copies of Rebecca, 4 copies of Merca, and 4 copies of Proof Basket Self. Just, I'm maxing out on the ones you play. It's pretty straightforward in that regard. Basket Self is useful for feeding Tomato. Merca is useful for getting that first token out. As the game goes on, she doesn't do as much as I thought she would. And Rebecca, I initially thought this card wasn't going to be as good as its rarity implied. And it's okay. The ability to give something a random 5k pump and help you rush your opponent down early game, as a common, well, not a common scenario, but a hypothetical scenario, is you did this, and then on your next turn, let's just grab our Sylvia. Sylvia gets your plant token. You can call this down, buff this up, and your opponent's on their AK grade 1, so this swings, and this swing. Unless your opponent hits a defensive trigger on this or this attack, these 2 attacks will threaten, and then at the end of the turn, you just Soul Blast 1, pop your token, bounces back, and you have some shield. Like, the fact it does return to your hand for extra guarding is really useful, especially in a meta where we have decks with waterfall clones, i.e. Angel Feather, which is, not surprisingly, one of your worst matchups, as this deck, unfortunately, has no real finishing power. It's just swing with 3 big lanes, the clan. Like, it's probably the most, how should I describe it? It is a force clan. Like, it is a force clan to a T. You don't have a guard restrictor, you don't have a restander, you just have 3 big swings, a la Set 1 Royal Paladin and Spike Brothers. Spike Brothers has a bit more pressure because of Safe Raid's multi-attacking potential, but yeah, against a deck like Angel Feather, which can just tank you out, they can no-guard your least lethal hit, and then PG the other 2, and that is an issue. So, with that being said, I'm maxing out on my crit triggers in this deck. See? 4 crits, 8 crits, and then 4 draws and 4 heal. You don't really need the extra draw triggers in this deck. If anything, they help you deck out faster against tankier builds, and as I mentioned before, you don't have any inherent crit pressure, so you need those extra crits to try and kill your opponent that much better, easier with Cecilia when you're trying to thin your deck out by 2 or 3 cards. And through Irminsul and Tomato, you have the ability to draw extra cards without draw triggers, so you can get away with only playing 4 in this deck. And, yeah. Oh yeah, starter, Broccolini Musketeer Kira. Not much else I can really say on that. Like, this is a pretty bog standard Neo Nectar deck list. The only real difference is that we, again, don't have the incredibly good promo card that made this deck a real terror in Japan. But even without that, this is still one of the top decks of the North American format, in my opinion. Apparently, it was doing pretty well at ARG States during the last couple of weekends. There hasn't been any noteworthy events, to my knowledge. Like, I know there hasn't been any bushy events. It's just been ARGs. And I've only heard about what happened at a couple of them, but I do believe that Neos have been performing well in spite of the fact that we don't have Garden Guide. And by the time we do get Garden Guide, Miyagi comes out, in which case we get Wave 2 Royal Paladins, which will then take this deck's spot. But if we take a look over what's been going on in Japan, this deck is still competitive even in spite of that. So anyone who picked up this deck is at least going to have something that will be useful for the current format, the Extra Booster 4 format, because Answer of Truth is honestly not a good set, and even Miyagi format. We'll see how this deck performs after the release of whatchamacallit, Violet's the Leader, and go from there. So until next time, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. This is Blue Star 99, checking out.